Do you ever have trouble sleeping, or do weird dreams wake you up or confuse you? You are not alone. There's a whole lot in the biblical narrative of these kind of situations, and they matter. Stay tuned. We'll talk about it. Welcome back to Kairos Conversations. I am Ryan Martin, our New Testament Greek guy, and I am joined by Courtney Trotter, our resident Hebrew enthusiast. If you're interested in the Bible, in the Old and New Testaments, and understanding them through the lenses of the original languages, of learning more about the background, the culture, the theology of the Old and New Testament, join us as we help you discover the world of the Bible through the biblical languages. And today we're going to talk about something that we really like to talk about here at Kairos, especially as we talk about the story arc of the Bible, and that is narrative patterning. And we've talked about this on this channel before, but we want to do that again today and look at this and look at another narrative pattern together. And there's no better place for us to start than really defining again this idea of narrative patterning. So, Courtney, can you tell us what that is and why it matters?
Yeah, so as we look for design patterns or narrative patterns, or some people might call them hyperlinks in the Hebrew Bible or throughout the entire Bible, these are places where we have like patterns of words or symbols or images that repeat multiple times over. And, so a lot of times we like doing just those individual word studies, but whenever we do that, we might miss the connections between different parts of the Bible and how they're playing off one another to try to teach us a particular point. So Old Testament theologian John Sailhammer was really well known for this. He has a book called The Pentateuch as Narrative that teaches you how to recognize these connections between stories. And other ministries like the Bible Project or Michael Heiser are really great popularizers of this method of reading and interpretation of the Bible. And it helps you understand the theological point of the author when you're noticing that, hey, they're wanting me to notice this story is kind of a repeat of this story. What significance does that have? So that's one reason why we like kind of looking at the Bible as story or as narrative and noticing those literary connections throughout.
Yeah, finding those patterns that the author or authors are intentionally putting in there to remind you of certain things, and the truth of what they're trying to communicate flows through that framework. Now, what would you say to someone who would say, look, Courtney, I mean, the Bible is the Bible. It's just telling you what happened, right? So you can't be reading all these weird, mysterious things into that. Just read it for what it says and take it as fact and move on. Don't worry about these patterns and stuff. What would you say to them?
Right. Yeah. Sometimes people get a little bit squirrely when you start saying like, oh, we're reading the Bible as narrative, or we're taking a literary approach or a story approach to scripture, because it seems like you're devaluing the historical aspect of that and saying, well, it's not history. But to that, I would just say, we notice that history has a pattern of repeating itself, that it is cyclical. And those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And in that same way, the Bible authors are trying to get us to recognize that this historical event is happening in light of what God has already done in the past. And we need to recognize how he's the same, or how these situations or events are the same, or how they might be different. And so it's always really exciting if you begin looking at it through this lens, because there are times where it's exactly the same, and there are times where it's kind of flipped on its head and it's different, but it's still calling back, echoing what came before.
Of course. And if I tell you a story of what happened to me yesterday or what happened to my family yesterday, I'm still going to tell the story in a way that I think makes sense to you and emphasize, like, I'm not going to include unnecessary details. I'm not going to tell you what time of day it was, if that doesn't matter. I'm still choosing what to tell you about, and embedded in those choices might be patterns of how stories typically happen, or here we go again. This has happened before and it happened again. And why would we not expect the Bible to use those same methods?
Exactly. And so many people do this with their own lives. Like they relate some situation that's happened in their own life to a biblical character. Like, oh, I really resonated with David through this season of my life. And so they notice the patterns between, something that happened in the Bible and what happened in their life. And that's no different than what's already happening within scripture. And it gets us to pay a little bit more attention to the small details. Instead of just looking at the story as a whole, we pay attention to why did the author put these words together. And so often
Yeah.
we tell our students like, hey, this is where, you often need Hebrew to be able to see this because you can't see that the word is the same in English because it's just not translated the same. But today we're going to give them some examples where you could see this. We're not going to use Hebrew at all today or Greek. We're just going to look at those small details in the story. And one of my favorite theologians, Michael Heiser, says, if it's weird, it's important. So pay attention to those small details because it might get your brain churning to thinking about scripture as a whole.
Absolutely. If it's weird, it's important. And what's the weird thing that we're going to be looking at today?
We were trying to do an Easter series and our lives just kind of got so crazy, but this is Easter late.
Hey, it's still Easter. It
was
Eastertide.
Eastertide. You're right. It's Eastertide. We were trying to do it Holy Week for Holy Week. So
closer, yeah.
Holy Week has passed. So this story in Matthew's gospel with Jesus before Pilate, this is the only gospel where we get this tiny little detail. Pilate's wife has had a bad night of sleep, that she's had these dreams. She goes to Pilate and she says to him, I have suffered much because of him today in a dream and had nothing to do with that righteous man. But instead, Pilate releases Barabbas and has Jesus whipped and delivers him over to be crucified. So you're like, why did we get this weird incident with Pilate's wife? We have this whole story between Jesus and Barabbas, and the crowd has a choice, and it's a rigged kind of vote, and they choose Barabbas over Jesus. And so Pilate gives them up. But this is the only one that tells us about Pilate's wife. And so it's easy to skip over it in the midst of our Holy Week readings and just not think of it as being very important.
4 Gospels describe the crucifixion of Jesus. Yet only Matthew tells us this. So we want to lean into that, right? Like, what is Matthew trying to communicate here? Why does he include this? Why in his limited space is he choosing this as something to give you? That's the good narrative patterning question, right? Why is he saying this? And what resources do we have within the theological worldview of the Bible to be able to understand that?
Right. Exactly. So whenever, like, if I'm reading that and I read, well, Pilate's wife has a bunch of bad dreams and she's talking about a righteous man, as she says there, who is in a time of crisis, it makes me think back to, like, okay, where have dreams been significant with a righteous person in a time of crisis in the Bible before? So that would be my first question. Like, so why is this sentence there? And so we get this weird pattern that comes up throughout the Old Testament of God's people who are in a time of crisis, and the ruler that is over them gets a dream. They're afflicted by these bad dreams. And as a result of being able to interpret the dream, then that person is then exalted and brought out of the crisis. So I call these diaspora dreams in times of crisis, because it's when God's people are not in the land and they are under the control of foreign rulers. So the ruler is afflicted by dreams. In Joseph and Daniel and Esther, there's always a hero in crisis. They're in prison, or there's a threat of death, or like in Esther, the whole people are threatened to be killed. And then the hero is brought into the foreign court. So both Joseph, Daniel, and Esther somehow make it into the foreign court. And then eventually they interpret the dream or help the ruler out. And God is acknowledged for the intervention as being the one that intervenes in both Joseph and Daniel. Joseph is described as the spirit of the gods is upon him. And Daniel is also described in the same way, and he as a servant of the Most High God. And then as a result, that hero is honored and elevated to the second in the kingdom, which is very odd. Like specifically the second in the kingdom in Joseph, in Daniel, and in Esther, Mordecai is elevated to the second in the kingdom. So that's our pattern there.
So how could that be an accident, right? Like this is a pattern. This thing is happening over and over again, and the authors of Scripture want you to recognize that. They want you to see that this thing is happening.
Right. It's such a weird thing. And you're like, okay, there's only one where it didn't line up for Esther. But there's a couple other instances where we just want to look at these stories in particular. So let's look at that story of Joseph and Pharaoh. Joseph is, of course, in prison as a result of the incident with Potiphar's wife. He interprets those dreams for the baker and the cupbearer and tells the cupbearer, hey, remember me when you get back to Pharaoh's court. And eventually, Pharaoh has these bad dreams. Look at that in verse 1. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And then he fell asleep in verse 5 and dreamed a second time. And when he awoke in verse 8, his spirit was troubled, right? So these are dream-afflicted rulers. So they get the dream, they're afflicted, and we have that hero in crisis. That's what's in yellow, the dreams and the hero in crisis. So Joseph is quickly brought up out of the pit. And in red, we're going to see that God acknowledgement. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning as wise as you are, and that exaltation is always in green. You shall be over my house, and see, I have set you over all of the land of Egypt. So that's what Pharaoh does for Joseph. And then we're going to see that in Daniel as well. Daniel is now in the period of exile after the fall of Jerusalem in Babylon. He and his compadres are again going to be threatened to be killed. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams, and his spirit is troubled, and his sleep left him. Very similar language as what was mentioned for Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
They sought, and so he brings in all of the other dream interpreters. Nobody can interpret the dream, so he's like, kill all of them, which includes Daniel. Kill all the wise men. Includes Daniel and his friends. So in verse 13, they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Yeah, so this is a crisis. The dreams plus the crisis.
That is a crisis indeed.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens coming out of the crisis?
What happens? So Daniel was eventually able to interpret that dream after praying to God and getting the revelation of the dream. And so Nebuchadnezzar honors Daniel there in green. He falls on his face and pays homage to Daniel, and he acknowledges God. Your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries, right? And then he gives Daniel many honors, great gifts, and makes him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. So he's exalted to that second place in the kingdom.
Second place in the kingdom.
Right.
Wow. All right. Is that all?
No, there's one more, and Esther is important because it kind of shifts up our pattern just a little bit. So pay attention to when our pattern gets shifted up. So here's Esther. Haman is going to attack the Jewish people, and there's this kind of backstory where Mordecai saved the king's life at one point in time. And so Haman is now trying to kill Mordecai and kill the Jewish people, and Esther is the queen in the court of the king. And so we get this story where the king in chapter 6 cannot sleep, gives orders to bring the book of memorable deeds. And in that book, it is mentioned that Mordecai saved the king's life. And the king says, well, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai? Like, how has he been honored for saving my life? And, his people say, oh, he hasn't been honored at all. So he goes and gets Haman, and he's like, Haman, you honor Mordecai, right? And as a result of this plot is figured out that he's planning to kill the Jews. And there's this incident where Haman looks like he's trying to take advantage of the queen, which reminds us also of Potiphar trying to take advantage of Joseph, right? So Haman appears to be taking advantage of the king. So the king wants to kill Haman. We don't get an acknowledgement of God here, the intervention of God in Esther. But this is one of those cases where just because Esther doesn't mention the name of God or mention God at all, if you notice this design pattern, you know how God is still working in this incident to affect the exaltation of his people and the salvation of his people. But they hang Haman as a result of his crimes, and Mordecai the Jew is then exalted to the second rank to King Ahasuerus. Second rank. Now, so the two things that are different in Esther is that it reminds us, like I said, it should remind us of Potiphar, the instance that got Joseph into prison, is the thing that exalts Mordecai and reveals the terrible nature of Haman's plot. And also, in this instance, the enemies of the Jewish people are actually vanquished, right? So like Haman is put to death, and the Jews are actually able to defend themselves as well. And so those are the two differences there in Esther, that the enemies are vanquished, and we have that connection back with Potiphar's wife.
One of the best gotcha moments in the whole Bible. Just to I imagine most of you, this makes a lot of sense, but I'm trying to imagine somebody that was skeptical of this kind of way of reading the Bible. This is not some secret meaning we're looking for or some code that we're deciphering. This is a very normal way that not only the Bible communicates, but that we communicate. So when biblical authors are doing this over and over again, they're just taking stories from the past and using those to inform the ones in the present. So as we move here to the New Testament, I want us to just keep in mind, this isn't weird, speculative looking for codes. This is just the normal way that people communicate based on their audience shared knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this is a normal way. Jews would have been taught to interpret the Bible and to see themselves in the story of the Bible and in just the way that they celebrate Passover every year, that they are reliving the story, that this is their history now in this present moment. And so when we get to Jesus and we already know that we're going to Jesus and Pilate's wife, it makes us ask a couple questions, right? Like, the Jews are back in the land, right? They're not technically in the diaspora anymore. They're back in the land. We should remember that they are still under foreign rulers. So many Jewish interpreters leading up into that Second Temple period in the time of Jesus still interpreted themselves in exile, even though they were able to return to the land because they did not have autonomy.
The glory of God leaves the temple, right? As Babylon is rushing in.
Yeah.
Is that Ezekiel? Am I right?
Yeah.
It when does it come back? It doesn't, right? So yeah, maybe they're back in the land, but Rome is the big boss, and it's not the same.
Right. Rome is the boss, and it's not the same. And it's interesting that though Pilate doesn't have these dreams, the second in command, or his wife, is the one that has a dream. So the ruler over the land is the one who still has the dream. So they're still in exile. That's one thing we're supposed to take away from it, even though they're back in the land. And it still is a dream-afflicted ruler. So whenever we get to Jesus and we see that there's a threat of death upon him, he's in this crisis, we're going to expect this pattern to be repeated again. Or Matthew wants us to expect this pattern to be repeated again. Well, we're going to see that it has a stunning reversal, at least initially. It has a stunning reversal in the book of Matthew. So we'll look back at that Matthew slide and revisit it. But Jesus is on trial with this rigged trial. They choose Barabbas over Christ. And she tells Pilate, don't have anything to do with him. He's a righteous man. And he still delivers him over to be crucified. So instead of the exaltation, we're getting death instead. So we don't have the green in this slide, right? But if you keep reading further on in that crucifixion story, if we keep that design pattern in mind, keep reading in Matthew 27, we get to this place as Jesus is hanging on the cross, and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, the ones who rigged the trial against Jesus, mock him. And they say, he saved others and he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, right? You're expecting the delivery from God. Every single time God has been acknowledged for delivering his people, we're expecting the delivery from God and exaltation of Christ. And instead he dies. And when the centurion and those who are with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw him pass away and saw the earthquake and everything that took place, they were filled with awe. And they said, truly, this was the Son of God. So the people who were persecuting Jesus did not notice that he was the Son of God. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, but it's all of the crowd that give acknowledgement to God at that point in time. And Jesus is not exalted at that moment on the cross, or he is, depending on how you read it in other gospels, but at that moment in Matthew on the cross, he's not. And he is then exalted 3 days later at his resurrection. So we have to wait for the exaltation, but we get the acknowledgement that he's the Son of God.
Wow, that's powerful. The design pattern is there, and we're reading it through that. And that brings our attention to the places in which the story deviates from that pattern. And that's the precise point that the author's trying to make, right?
And now you can almost even understand the disciples' dismay that he actually died, because they're expecting the pattern to repeat itself, even if they're not quite thinking totally in those terms.
God vindicates his people.
God vindicates his people. Yeah.
That's powerful. And this, I mean, again, like, it's very logical to me. It's not this mysterious, weird, new way of reading the text. This is like, the more we understand the historical and literary context of the Bible, the more the Bible makes sense in those patterns, and the more the Bible seems like one coherent story of God's promises to his people, and the more we are able to see Christ as the center of that. And it's not a lot of these questions about typology and what does it mean for Jesus to fulfill the law and the prophets. And there's these big theological traditions behind these questions. And I think a lot of that can be kind of collapsed into reading the Bible literarily and letting these things kind of explain themselves, letting the gospel writers show you, using the Old Testament, be it by direct quotation or these broader design patterns, how Jesus is fulfilling and filling up the story of Israel from both the perspective of the covenant maker and the covenant keeper.
Exactly. And just like a closing thought is, again, this is how the Jews wanted to read their Bible. And so Matthew, being the gospel primarily written to a Jewish audience, makes sense that he's casting it in light of these events. And it just gets you, so many people still read like our own present persecution as Christians and in other countries or something through this same light, that though it may look like their death is complete defeat, that they are exalted with Christ now. So that stunning reversal then becomes the story of so many martyrs and heroes of the faith who have gone before us into death. And we see in the book of Revelation are exalted even now. So it is a beautiful picture for us as believers as well. So if you're someone who wants to like look more into this, like John Sailhamer's book, Pentateuchus Narrative, is always a really great place to start if you want to like get a more scholarly opinion on how to do this. Somewhere like the Bible Project has tons of really great 5-minute videos that are way better than ours that can show you these things in a very nice fashion. So
Yeah, even the Bible Project's little overviews of each book are going to point out these things.
Right, exactly.
And tie these things together. That's great. Well, thank you, Courtney. Again, this is one example, but we hope that you see this pattern and that you are able, as you read the Bible, to be able to pick up on these things that are happening. And the more we can enculturate ourselves into the culture, into the worldview of the Old and New Testaments, the more we're able to see these things for ourselves, which is really encouraging and just helps us read the Bible better. If you are interested in these kinds of questions about the Old and New Testament, watch our other videos. We do these every week, post them every Friday. You can support us on Patreon, get some goodies, some extra content. Make sure you like and subscribe, do all those YouTube things. But we will see you next time here on Kairos Conversations.